This story took place back in 1998. I was 24 and 2 years out of college. Me and a few old college friends had decided to take a couple of days off work and go on a camping trip. Each of us had already become pretty bored of the monotony of our daily working lives and were keen to relive some of our more carefree college days. Me and my 4 friends, Carl, Tina, Andy and Michelle, piled into my pickup truck in Phoenix and set off towards the Mojave Desert. We had camped out quite a few times during our college days, always rambling aimlessly until we found a suitable spot. But this time was different. This time, we had a very specific destination in mind. We were heading for the fabled Mojave phone booth. For those of you who don't know, the Mojave phone booth was a phone booth which sat in complete isolation in the middle of the Mojave Desert, miles and miles from the nearest building. It had been used by workers of a nearby mine, but now was pretty much unused for outgoing calls. Its number and details had been published in magazines and online, and was one of the early internet sensations. People from all around the world would call the phone 24 hours a day and talk to whoever was there. People who lived within a few hours of the booth would go and camp out next to it and wait for calls. And that's what we planned on doing. We set out from Phoenix around noon, planning on finding the booth before sunset. The journey, for the most part, was a pretty pleasant one. We spent about 6 hours on the highway. However, the end of the journey was absolutely brutal. The last few miles up to the phone booth is basically just a dirt track. After half an hour of being hammered by every pothole and divot in the road, I can't describe the joy I felt when the booth finally came into view. We parked the truck, unpacked our things, and took a look at our final destination. It wasn't the most beautiful sight in the world, smashed in windows, graffiti tags, and trash everywhere, but that didn't matter. We were here at last. We had no idea when the first call would come, so we settled down with some snacks and a couple of beers. Carl played a few songs on his guitar, despite nobody asking him to. Yeah, he was one of those. 20 minutes later, he had just butchered the first few chords of Stairway to Heaven when a shrill ringing pierced the air. Excited, we dropped everything and rushed over to the booth. I was the first to the phone, holding up the receiver and cupping the earpiece to try to amplify it enough for everybody. "Hello, Mojave phone booth." There was a pause before we heard a grunt and a chuckle at the other end. "No way, dude. Are you serious?" "Yup," I answered. "You got through." There then followed a pretty unproductive 5-minute conversation with what turned out to be a very stoned high school student from Florida. We spent most of the conversation trying to explain to him who we were and where we came from, before he suddenly said, "Shit, I think my mom is coming. Bye, guys," and hung up. Less than inspired by our first phone call, we returned to our newly built campfire. We weren't too disappointed, though. Tonight was as much about beer and reminiscence as it was about the phone booth. We needn't have worried anyway. Over the following few hours, after the sun had set, we got quite a few interesting callers, mainly from around the US. Baltimore, Fort Worth, and Kansas City, to name just a few. However, some of the more interesting calls came from abroad. These included an eccentric German who was eager to read us some of his poetry, a Russian who wanted us to draw a devil's pentagram and perform some ritual for reasons unknown, and a friendly Australian who was keen on making the trip to Mojave himself. As the evening wore on, the calls began to peter out. This didn't bother us, however. We simply dropped back into our pattern of beer and gossiping about old college days. As midnight approached, fatigue began to get the better of us. We were all thinking about turning in for the night when, suddenly, Carl noticed something up along the track we had driven. Headlights. We were all amazed that none of us had noticed the car arriving, given how dark and quiet the night had been. But there it was, sitting about 200 yards up the dirt track. At first we were taken aback, but Carl and Tina, ever the helpful ones, decided that the car must belong to fellow travellers. They set off down the track to try and help them find the phone booth, which we felt sure must be their destination. Once the two of them got about 20 or 30 yards down the road, the lights went out, and the vague sound of wheels spinning was all we could hear. They froze in surprise, the dim light of the bonfire being all that illuminated them. "What the fuck?" mumbled Carl. We all stood motionless, staring down the track for about 5 seconds, before Tina turned on her heel and said, "I guess the guys must be lost." It was a bit of a strange one, but the mood and the conversation was still pretty nonchalant. We continued to tidy up and pack away some of our stuff, either into the truck or into our tents. 10 minutes later, we were once again just about to go to sleep. This time, it was me who noticed it. The headlights. Now a little farther away, maybe 250 or 300 yards away from us. None of us ventured forward towards the car this time. Instead, huddling around our end of the dirt track, watching with a slight sense of unease. Nobody said anything for about 20 seconds. Just as I was about to speak, the silence was broken by a sound coming from behind us. When we turned to look the other way up the track, my stomach dropped. Facing us was another set of headlights. When the car was about 150 yards away from us, we heard the driver turn off the car's engine. He then turned off the headlights, turned on the car's internal light, and got out of the car. He stood leaning against his vehicle, staring up the road at where we were gathered. What followed was several seconds of the most intense silence I have ever experienced. It was finally broken by Michelle. "Guys, I don't know what the fuck is going on here, but I don't feel comfortable anymore." Carl, trying to act tough, blurted out, "Geez, guys, come on, it's probably nothing." Me, Andy, Tina and Michelle all looked at each other awkwardly, none of us wanting to mention the quiver we heard in Carl's voice. We stood around in the clearing, wordlessly glancing back and forth between the two sets of headlights and occasionally off into the moonlit desert. This lasted for about a minute until Andy suddenly exclaimed, "Jesus Christ, what the hell is that?" We all turned to face what he was looking at. When I saw it, I could barely believe my eyes. Approaching us across the desert plain were 8 lights bobbing back and forth. 8 torches being held in the air. We couldn't make out any details, but they seemed to be pacing in unison towards us across the desert plain. Once they got within about 100 yards of us, they stopped. We could just about make out the outlines of the dark cloaks they were wearing. All of us were frozen in place, none of us having a clue what to do next. Although it was probably only about 7 or 8 seconds, it seemed like an eternity before Andy finally broke the silence. He whispered under his breath, "Okay guys, no sudden movements, let's just slowly make our way towards the truck. It's going to be tough for them to follow us across the desert plain if they try anything." We all began to very slowly edge backwards, trying to cover the 20 yards or so back to the truck as inauspiciously as possible. The silence was deafening. Every rustle of clothes, every footstep, every breath was amplified 100 times. The group standing in front of us didn't seem to react to our movements. Neither did the 2 cars. Almost noiselessly, we had made our way to within 4 or 5 yards of the truck, when suddenly the silence was shattered. The phone rang. It hadn't rung for about 3 hours. Was this some guy in a faraway time zone trying his luck? Maybe this was a lifeline, someone who could help us. I glanced down the dirt track and my heart sank as I saw the man leaning against his car, holding a mobile phone to his ear. Within seconds, all of the others had seen what I had seen. We stood, staring at each other, each of us knowing what we had to do, but none of us wanting to admit it. The tension built and built, before finally I said out loud, "Enough! I'm putting an end to this." I turned towards the phone booth and began to walk, my knees weak and my throat dry. As I reached the booth, I raised my hand tremulously, picking up the receiver and putting it to my ear. I could barely manage to croak out the word, "Hello?" After a couple of seconds, he responded with the sentence that I have repeated to police officers, detectives, and all of my psychiatrists over the years. "Go ahead, get in the truck. We'll give you a head start."